Well, this week ASPI launched a new strategy report entitled Beyond bin Laden, Future Trends in Terrorism. This came about as a result of bin Laden's death in May of this year at the hands of US Special Forces in Abbottabad in Pakistan, and many of the questions that then were raised following that death to suggest that having severed al-Qaeda Central from its principal figurehead, does this mean the end of al-Qaeda as an organisation? Does it in fact mean the end of global terrorism? So our research focused on that question, and it actually sort of followed the trends that are driving the current wave of global terrorism around the world. And the fact is that terrorism has shifted, it's changing pace and direction. And the report highlights specifically the geographic shift in global terrorism towards North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and even South Asia. It highlights some of the ideological changes that have occurred within al-Qaeda itself. The reality is, in 2010, of the last year, of the 20 major terrorist plots against the West, one was organised by al-Qaeda Central, which still exists in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Another 4 were conducted by al-Qaeda franchises, particularly out of the Arabian Peninsula. And the vast bulk of them, the other 15, were in fact as a result of homegrown terrorists, individuals who may have or may not have had some connection to these various franchises, but have decided to go out and to conduct a terrorist operation by themselves. These included people like Faisal Shahzad, who attempted to blow up a car in Times Square in the middle of last year, and others. So our report traces these trends as they're occurring throughout the world, and the conclusion that we come to is that far from over, al-Qaeda-ism as an ideology will continue to be an important security concern for the West for a number of decades to come. When we looked specifically at the shifting geography of terrorism, it's clear that the areas of statelessness in places like Yemen and Somalia, even in places like southern Thailand and the southern Philippines in our own region, it's the intersection of these ethno-religious grievances with areas of statelessness, outside state control, that are the fermenting grounds for international terrorism. So dealing with those problems of the civil wars in places like Yemen and Somalia in particular are going to be critical. But in some ways geography may not be as important as it was even 10 years ago. And the simple reason is because so much of the global terrorist ideological debate has shifted to the internet. The internet has become the principal tool through which al-Qaeda, its franchises and other groups are now seeking to disseminate information, to recruit, and ultimately to use that propaganda in order to radicalize people, particularly young people in the West. So dealing with the internet is going to be one of those critical areas for future counter-terrorism efforts. The paper makes some suggestions about where Australian counter-terrorism and counter-radicalisation responses should go, and in particular we say we should focus on 3 broad areas now. The first is individuals. It's so important in this debate, I think, to understand individual pathways towards radicalisation, how some of the individuals who have become involved in global terrorism, what are their motivations for getting involved? What are the sociological backgrounds that have led them that way? And in understanding quite nuanced and finely grained detail about these individuals, we can begin to deal with the problem on an individual basis. That's very much true of what's going on in Southeast Asia, and our previous research has looked at this individualization process in terms of the former members of Jamaat Islamiyah, for instance, now describing themselves as freelancers, freelance mujahideen, individuals no longer bound by any organizational affiliation, but simply prepared to go out and to conduct operations on their own. that individualization is in fact part of a broader ideological debate that's going on within al-Qaeda and its various franchises, and driven very much so by ideologues like al-Suri, for instance, in his 2005 book on, and others, the now deceased Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born preacher who had been living in Yemen. These individuals now are at the forefront of the ideological debate, and they are arguing specifically that organisations are no longer the hub of global terrorist action, and in fact the responsibility comes down to individuals, both in these areas of statelessness but also in the West. The second area where I think counter-terrorism efforts are going to need to improve are on institutions. And it's clear that although we've done some good work in places like Indonesia and in South Asia, the infrastructure of terrorism is built around the series of religious boarding schools, the madrasas, the pesantren in Southeast Asia, mosques and prayer groups that continue to provide a framework, an institutional framework for the ideological dissemination of this violent extremism. So dealing with institutions, including working with communities themselves, both here and overseas, in rooting out those institutions that are fomenting this kind of religious extremism is going to be really important as we move forward. And finally, the internet, as I said before, the internet is a critical aspect of how al-Qaeda has constructed and disseminated its particular brand of violent extremism, and so I think Western counter-terrorism officials have known this for a long time, but the difficulty is, of course, is the internet is a free and open access infrastructure, and we're very reluctant to try and tamper with that. The reality is, though, that we do intervene when we consider some material on the internet to be abhorrent, child pornography being an example. And I also think we should say that extremist religious material that espouses violence in the name of religion should be classed in the same way, seen as abhorrent, and those websites that are out there, some reports say as many as 5,000 now exist, those websites of terrorist organisations, we should actively try and ban them, take them down wherever they appear. That's a very difficult thing to do, and it would need to be done in conjunction with both telecommunications industries, internet service providers and others, and law enforcement officials. But the fact is, even though the material may find itself somewhere else, and we're never going to eradicate it completely, by banning this sort of violent extremist material, we hopefully will reduce the risk that young, impressionable individuals, particularly in the West, are going to tap into this material and become radicalized by it. So it's a risk reduction strategy, if you like. I think that that argument of taking down this material now outweighs the arguments, perhaps, that may have been made in the past about either the security intelligence agencies wanting to monitor this material online, better that we know what's out there than it be forced underground, or even the civil libertarian argument about free speech. I think some material is so abhorrent that it deserves to be seen as such, and for governments to declare it to be abhorrent. And so this paper advocates that we ban all online extremist material from terrorist websites.